The rain had already started by the time Naomi Voss stepped out of the cab onto East 61st Street, the kind of cold Manhattan drizzle that felt personal, that found the gap between your collar and your neck and stayed there. She paused on the sidewalk for exactly 3 seconds, not from hesitation but from the habit she had developed over the past 2 years of bracing herself before walking through any door that belonged to the Harlow family. Then she straightened her coat over her stomach, felt the familiar weight of 7 months pressing against the wool, and walked into the Ashford Grand. The restaurant had been chosen by Constance, as everything in their lives had been chosen by Constance. It was the kind of place where the lighting was calibrated to make the right people look luminous, and everyone else look like they were trying too hard. Crystal caught the candlelight at each table setting. The maitre d' recognized Naomi. He had seen her at 4 of these annual dinners, and his expression performed the particular acrobatics of someone trained to show warmth toward people. The management had not explicitly told him to welcome. He led her through the main floor and into the private dining room where the Harlow family had reserved every table, every chair, every inch of air. 55 people turned when the door opened. 55 people who had watched Naomi navigate these rooms for 2 years, who had accepted champagne from servers while she stood slightly apart from clusters of conversation, who had witnessed Constance Harlow manage her daughter-in-law the way a gardener manages an invasive species, with patience and precision and the unshakable belief that nature, given enough time, would correct the error. Prescott was already standing near the bar. He was wearing the charcoal suit she had laid out for him that morning, which struck her now as a detail so ordinary it felt cruel. He did not look at her when she entered. He was talking to a woman with copper blonde hair and an emerald dress cut to signal arrival rather than attendance. Sloane Whitfield, whom Constance had been introducing at these events for 6 months as a colleague, in the tone people use for words they want you to hear but not examine too closely. Naomi took her seat, the same seat she always occupied at these dinners, at the far end of the main table, positioned with the geometric precision of an afterthought. She had understood the seating arrangement the first time she sat in it, and she had sat in it every year since with the particular discipline of a woman who had decided that her endurance was not the same thing as her acceptance. Constance moved through the room the way water moves through a system of pipes, seemingly effortless, actually engineered. She was 66 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had decided at some point in her 40s that age was a negotiation she intended to win. Her hair was silver and set with the kind of formal precision that communicated not vanity but authority. She wore a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her own mother, and she touched them sometimes in conversation the way other people touch a pulse point. She paused beside 2 board members near the fireplace, laughed at something that wasn't funny, and then turned her gaze across the room toward Naomi with an expression that contained everything she had never needed to say out loud. The dinner began. Courses arrived. Wine was poured. Conversations rose and fell in the particular rhythm of rooms where people are performing a version of themselves they believe others find impressive. Naomi ate carefully, spoke when spoken to, smiled at the right intervals. Across the table, Prescott refilled Sloane's glass before his own wife's. He did it without thinking, which was somehow worse than if he had done it deliberately. Constance Harlow stood up. She stood the way she did everything, with the measured confidence of someone who had choreographed the moment well in advance. She lifted her glass and waited for the room to quiet itself, which it did immediately because rooms always quieted for Constance Harlow. She looked at her son first, then swept her gaze across the assembled guests with the warmth of a woman about to bestow something. "Our family has been waiting for this for a long time." Her voice was clear and composed, the vowels carrying the faint polish of old Connecticut money. "There are moments in a family's life that define what it becomes. Tonight is one of those moments." She turned to Prescott. "Son, This is the time. Prescott set down his glass. He did not look at Naomi. He stood and the room shifted toward him in anticipation, and then he turned to face Sloane Whitfield and introduced her, with the careful phrasing of a legal document, precise and bloodless, as the woman who would be sharing his future. The room responded with the particular noise of 55 people recalibrating simultaneously, a sound that was not quite applause and not quite silence. Something in between that lives in the throat and never becomes a word. Naomi sat very still. She had known something was coming. She had found the divorce papers 11 days ago in the bottom drawer of Prescott's desk, beneath a billing folder marked with a client name she didn't recognize. She had stood in his study for a long time, reading them, then folded them precisely and put them back. She had not told him she found them. She had waited, because she had learned growing up with Garrett Voss that patience was not passivity. It was a form of power that people consistently underestimated in quiet women. But knowing a thing is coming and having it arrive in front of 55 witnesses are two entirely different experiences, and she understood in that moment the geometry of what Constance had built. This was not a dinner. It was a demolition, staged to have an audience, designed so that whatever Naomi did next could be evaluated and catalogued and discussed at subsequent events for years. Constance set down her champagne flute and moved toward Naomi with the unhurried purpose of someone executing a plan they have rehearsed. She reached across the table and lifted Naomi's left hand, as though examining a piece of jewelry she was considering returning. Then she removed the ring, a single motion, practiced and final, and placed it on the white linen tablecloth between them, where it sat in the candlelight like a verdict. To avoid any misunderstanding, darling. The word darling, when Constance used it, had never been an endearment. It was a bracket, something that contained what came before and after it but added no warmth to either. The room held its breath. Naomi looked at the ring on the tablecloth. Then she looked at Prescott, who was studying the floor with the fixed attention of a man who had decided that what he couldn't see couldn't require a response. Then she looked at Sloane Whitfield, who had the expression of someone watching an outcome they calculated correctly, whose calculation was now being confirmed. A server appeared at her left elbow. Young, maybe 29, with the kind of face that hadn't yet learned to perform neutrality under pressure. He was pouring water she hadn't asked for, the pitcher held carefully, his eyes directed away from her face with a tact that was more respectful than anything else in the room. He said quietly without looking up, the words arriving soft enough that only she could hear them. "You don't have to stay here." His name tag read Callum. Naomi stood. She did not push back her chair. She did not raise her voice. She placed both hands flat on the table for a moment, a gesture that was not aggression but anchoring, as though she needed to feel the solidity of something real. And then she looked directly at Constance Harlow with an expression that 55 people would later struggle to describe accurately, because it contained grief and clarity in equal measure, and most of them had never seen those two things occupy the same face. "You just made the one mistake you can't walk back." The words came out steady, unhurried, carrying the particular weight of something that has been thought about and decided rather than felt and reacted to. Then she picked up her bag, accepted the coat that Callum had retrieved from somewhere and was now holding out to her, and walked out of the dining room, through the main floor of the Ashford Grand and through the front door into the rain. Outside, the city continued its indifference. Taxis moved up East 61st Street. A man walked a dog that was equally uninterested in where it was going. The rain had thickened and Naomi stood under the awning for a moment, one hand pressed to the curve of her stomach, feeling the baby shift in response to something. Stress hormones, probably. The body talking to itself. Constance came through the door behind her. She did not hurry. She came to stand beside Naomi under the awning with the composed stillness of someone finishing a conversation rather than starting one. She waited until a couple walked past, then turned her head slightly and spoke the words close enough that they arrived directly rather than traveling through the damp air. The blood running through you will never be part of this family. I want you to understand that clearly, not because I'm unkind, but because clarity is a mercy. Naomi said nothing. Whatever arrangement you came from, whoever you were before you walked into my son's life, that's where you need to return. This was always going to end here. Then Constance did the one thing she had never permitted herself in 2 years of surgical, calculated, deniable cruelty. She leaned forward slightly and she spat. It was a small thing in the physical sense. In every other sense, it was enormous. It was the place where Constance Harlow's architecture finally exceeded its own engineering, where the structure of plausible deniability collapsed into something undisguised and permanent. Naomi stood in the rain and did not flinch. She reached into her coat pocket, withdrew a handkerchief, and wiped her face with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided well in advance how they would respond to the worst thing anyone could do to them in a public space. She folded the handkerchief carefully, put it back in her pocket. Then she took out her phone and dialed. It rang twice. When he answered, she said, "Ethan, I have my answer." She heard him breathe, then carefully, "I'll have someone outside in 4 minutes." She stood in the rain and waited, and Constance Harlow went back inside, and the city continued its indifference, and Callum Reed came out with an umbrella he had obtained from somewhere inside the restaurant and stood next to her without speaking, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for her in months. To understand what Naomi Voss was doing standing in the rain outside a restaurant on East 61st Street, 7 months pregnant, having just watched her husband announce his engagement to another woman. You need to go back not to Manhattan, but to a city 2 states south, where the summers are long and the soil is red clay, and where a girl named Naomi learned that silence was not the same as weakness. Birmingham, Alabama. Specifically a neighborhood of small houses on wide lots where the families knew each other by the sounds of their daily routines, whose car engine turned over at 6:15, whose screen door had the particular creak of wanting oil. Garrett Voss lived in a house on Carmichael Road with a workshop in the back where he built furniture and repaired what other people had decided was broken. He was 53 now, but when Naomi was small, he was a man in his early 40s with the kind of hands that always had something useful to do, and the kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness but something more like depth. Eleanor Voss taught music at Roosevelt Elementary. She had a voice that Naomi remembered the way you remember the smell of a specific place, not with your mind, but with your whole body. She was the kind of woman who knew things she couldn't explain knowing, who used to sit at the kitchen table after dinner with a cup of tea going cold beside her and a particular expression on her face that Naomi had recognized later in life as the expression of someone carrying information they have decided to carry alone. Naomi was 17 when the call came. She had been at Keisha Drummond's house on a Friday evening, studying for a chemistry exam they both knew she was going to pass and Keisha was going to approximately survive, when Garrett's truck pulled up at the curb in a way that told her before she reached the door that the world had changed its shape. He stood on the front steps with his hat in his hands, a gesture she had never seen him make before, the hat held not as an accessory but as an object. A man grips when he has nothing else to grip, and he said her mother was gone. Route 31 southbound in the rain. The car had gone off the road. The police report said driver error. Conditions were poor. These things happen. Garrett had stood in the kitchen later that night after Naomi had cried herself into exhaustion on the couch, and he had looked at the wall above the stove for a long time in a way that she understood years later was not grief. It was the expression of a man doing a calculation, weighing what he knew against what he could prove, weighing safety against truth, weighing his own fear against what the truth might cost his daughter. He chose safety. He chose silence. He moved them to Nashville, Tennessee within 4 months. Changed their surname from Blackwell to Voss, the name of his own grandmother, he said, a way to honor family. Enrolled Naomi in a new school, built his workshop in the garage of the new house. Never explained exactly why they left, never told her what he suspected about the road on Route 31 and who might have understood how wet the road was and where the guardrails were weakest. Eleanor had left one thing behind, besides everything she had always meant to say, an envelope, sealed with her own handwriting across the flap. Open when you need it most. Garrett kept it in the cedar box on his dresser for 20 years before he could bring himself to tell Naomi it existed. She grew up in Nashville. She became, over time, a person who was genuine in the way that people who have survived real loss become genuine, not without armor but without performance. She taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary, where she was known among the parents for having the particular gift of making children feel seen rather than managed. She had a 1-bedroom apartment near Shelby Park. She had a book club that met on the 2nd Thursday of every month. She had a life that was real and modest and hers, which she had built herself with the tools available to her. 3 years ago, at an arts festival in the Gulch, she dropped a paperback. She had been carrying too many things: iced coffee, catalog from the photography exhibit she had just left, her bag strapped crossways, the paperback tucked under her arm. It hit the pavement at the corner of 11th and Pine with the particular defeated sound of a book that has been dropped before. The man who picked it up was standing close enough to reach it first. He looked at the cover, then at her, and said, without any particular attempt at charm, "Dostoevsky in July, that's ambitious." His name was Prescott Harlow. He was in Nashville for a client consultation, he explained when she asked, and he was killing an afternoon between meetings. He asked if she'd read it before. She said twice. He said he'd tried once and stopped 40 pages in because he felt he was being judged. She laughed. He wrote his phone number on the back of the gallery's printed schedule and handed it to her with the directness of a man who had decided to do the thing rather than calculate whether to do it. The first year was real. She needed people who knew her then to confirm this, because in the years that followed she would sometimes wonder if she had invented the reality of it, but it was real. He drove down from New York to Nashville on 3 separate weekends in the first 2 months. He sent her book recommendations with handwritten notes tucked inside the covers explaining exactly which pages had stayed with him. On their 4-month anniversary, he left a folded piece of paper in the pocket of her jacket while she was sleeping, which she found at 6 in the morning before work. 4 sentences about what he thought her laugh sounded like, which she read and reread standing in her kitchen in the gray early light, feeling the particular vulnerability of being known. They were married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony, Nashville. Garrett walked her down the aisle. She moved to Manhattan. She entered a world she had never navigated before, not the money, which she had not had, but the social architecture, the networks of relationship built over generations of proximity to wealth, the intricate grammar of who deferred to whom in which room and why. And she entered Constance Harlow's field of attention. Constance had said nothing directly unkind to Naomi in 2 years. This was the most important fact about her, the one that made her more dangerous than a woman who simply said the cruel thing. She operated through calibrated suggestion, through the particular construction of sentences that carried meaning at a frequency just below what could be challenged directly. She told the wives of Prescott's colleagues that Naomi was so refreshingly different from what we expected, in the tone of a woman complimenting a surprising vegetable. She praised Naomi's teaching background with the warmth of someone noting that domestic help had really become quite skilled these days. She worried aloud, in intimate settings, whether the social demands of Prescott's position might be taxing for someone from a simpler world. Her concern so perfectly calibrated to appear maternal that it was impossible to separate from the damage it was designed to cause. Prescott heard these things. He heard them the way you hear music you aren't paying attention to, absorbed without acknowledgement, accumulated without awareness. And slowly, the man who had driven 3 hours on a weekend to see her, who had left notes in her jacket pocket, who had said, "I don't know what I'm doing without you," on the phone from a hotel room in Chicago. That man became someone who flinched slightly when asked about his wife at industry events, who came home later without explanation, who stopped leaving notes in jacket pockets and seemed not to notice the absence of the habit. Naomi had watched this happen with the careful attention of someone trying to identify the exact mechanism of a leak before the ceiling comes down. She had understood by the time she was 6 months pregnant that the erosion was intentional and structural rather than incidental. She had also understood that understanding it and stopping it were different problems with different tools. What she had not understood, what she could not have understood without knowing what she now knew, was that the erosion had a different architect than she had identified. Constance was not working alone. What the audience sees first when they look at Ethan Blackwell is the building. 44 stories of glass and steel on Fifth Avenue with his name on the lobby floor in letters cut into Vermont marble. They see the Forbes profile from 3 years ago with the headline about self-made fortunes and the photograph of a man in his late 40s with the kind of stillness in his face that comes from having survived something. They see the philanthropic work, the technology empire, the board seats, the speaking engagements at institutions that invited him not because of what he owned but because of what he knew. What they do not see, because it has never been written about anywhere, is Alabama. Specifically, the state foster care system in Jefferson County, which received a 13-year-old boy named Ethan Blackwell in the fall of a year when the leaves turned early. Brought in by paramedics from the county hospital where he had spent 6 days recovering from injuries that the admitting physician had documented with a clinical precision that said everything without saying anything directly. The intake forms noted that the mother was unavailable, had fled the household, and that the father was being held for questioning. Owen Blackwell was not held for long. He was a man who understood systems from the inside, who had spent years building relationships with people whose job was to ask questions and who could be persuaded not to ask certain ones. He was out within a week. He spent the years that followed looking for Eleanor, who had taken his infant daughter and disappeared into a geography he couldn't immediately map. He looked methodically and with considerable resources, none of which were legal. Ethan spent the years that followed doing something different. He had, at 13, already developed the quality that would eventually build his fortune, the ability to assess the components of a situation without the emotional interference of hoping the situation were otherwise. He understood that his mother had made the only choice available to her. He did not resent it. He filed it in the category of facts that were true and painful and unchangeable, and he built his life on the ground that was actually under his feet rather than the ground he wished were there. By 19, he was coding for a startup in Birmingham that a venture capitalist in Atlanta acquired 2 years later. By 26, he had founded his own company. By his mid-30s, Blackwell Holdings had subsidiaries on 3 continents, and Ethan had the specific kind of wealth that stops being about money and starts being about infrastructure. The ability to build systems that other people's lives pass through without noticing. He found Naomi 5 years ago. He had hired a private researcher 18 months before that, when a combination of genealogical records and an insurance database finally provided a thread he could follow. The trail led from Alabama to Tennessee, from a death certificate in Jefferson County to a change of name filing in Nashville, from Eleanor Blackwell to Eleanor Voss to Garrett Voss. A man Ethan had been able to verify within 72 hours was not related to Eleanor, but had been connected to her in Birmingham for years before her death. A man raising a daughter who was not biologically his. Ethan had not approached immediately. This was the decision that cost him the most, in the particular currency of waiting, the knowledge that his sister was somewhere specific. that she had a face and an address and a daily routine he could have intersected at any moment, held against the calculation that approaching too early or from the wrong direction could collapse. Whatever safety Garrett Voss had spent decades building, he watched, he learned, he arranged, quietly and through layers of structure that left no visible trace, to have certain things in place, certain protections, certain information pathways, so that if anything moved against Naomi, he would know before it reached her. When she married Prescott Harlow and moved to Manhattan, Ethan understood two things simultaneously: that his sister was now in his city within reach for the first time in 37 years, and that Prescott Harlow had connections he needed to map more carefully before he could assess whether the marriage was what it appeared to be. What he found over the following year was that it appeared initially to be genuine. Prescott had met Naomi before certain other parties had identified her. The love had been real or something indistinguishable from real. Ethan had held this information alongside his instinct to intervene and chosen restraint, chosen to wait for clarity rather than act on suspicion. Then Adrienne Mack called him. Adrienne was a senior investigator at the FBI's Organized Crime Division in the New York field office, and she had been building a file on Owen Blackwell's extended network for 7 years. A file that had, until recently, been missing a piece that would allow prosecution to move from theoretical to actionable. She had reached out to Ethan 3 years ago through a mutual contact, carefully aware that the conversation required a particular kind of trust to initiate. Owen Blackwell's youngest biological child, a daughter no one in the network had been able to locate for decades, had just been located. And 2 men with significant criminal records and deeper ties to Owen's organization than anyone had previously documented had begun making inquiries. Trigg and Deacon Blackwell were Owen's sons from a first marriage, older than Ethan by a decade, harder in the specific way of men who had learned early that the world rewarded ruthlessness and never updated that lesson, with evidence to the contrary. They had been watching for Owen's other biological children for years, waiting for the appeals process to exhaust itself, waiting for the certainty of permanent incarceration before moving to consolidate what Owen had spent a lifetime accumulating. A daughter, legitimate, traceable, bearing a blood claim that could complicate inheritance under any number of legal frameworks, was a problem they intended to neutralize before it became structural. Their method was Prescott Harlow. He had been, years ago, a first-year associate at a firm that briefly represented Owen on a real estate matter. He had signed documents he hadn't fully read in the way of young lawyers billing hours under supervision. And 2 of those documents, Trigg and Deacon had kept copies, bore his signature alongside financial structures that were not, on careful examination, real estate transactions at all. The exposure was limited but real enough to be weaponized. When they approached Prescott 18 months into his marriage to Naomi, he understood immediately that refusal was not available to him, that the cost of the document would be extracted whether or not he agreed to cooperate, and that cooperation at least came with parameters. The parameters were: surveil Naomi, document her connections, report anything that suggested she was aware of her biological family, and ensure that any child born from the marriage was on record as a Harlow, a name that could later be used to establish a line of claim against Owen's assets that Trigg and Deacon could then contest, redirect, and ultimately absorb. Prescott had complied. He had also, somewhere in the compliance, allowed the thing that had been genuinely real in the beginning to become a function, a mechanism rather than a marriage. He had let Constance's constant pressure complete the work of making his wife a stranger to him. And he had sat across from Naomi at breakfasts and dinners for 18 months, knowing what his presence in her life was actually costing her. None of this exonerated him. He knew that. The knowledge sat in him the way certain things sit, Not as guilt, which requires a conscience that still believes in alternatives, but as a kind of blunt understanding of his own capacity for self-preservation, at the expense of someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Naomi standing outside the Ashford Grand in the rain while a 29-year-old server held an umbrella over her in a black car with no visible markings turned onto East 61st Street, knew none of this yet. She knew the divorce papers. She knew the private investigator's report she had found alongside them, which detailed her movements with the thoroughness of someone who had been watching her for months. She knew the page attached to the back of that report, a single sheet, printed from what appeared to be a genealogical database, bearing the name Eleanor Blackwell at the top of a family tree that Naomi had never seen rendered in formal structure before. She knew that Prescott had said when she confronted him 3 days before the dinner, "You were a legal problem I needed to manage," in the tone of a man who has decided that the cruelest truth is the most efficient exit. She knew that the words had landed not as a revelation but as a confirmation of something she had already understood and had not yet let herself fully form. She knew that when she had said the name Blackwell in that confrontation, quietly watching his face, his expression had changed in a way that told her the name was not incidental, and she knew, standing now in the rain, watching the black car stop at the curb, watching the door open, that whatever came next was not going to be a resolution of the problem she thought she had. It was going to be the beginning of something much larger than a marriage ending. The driver held the door. She got in. The car smelled like leather and fresh air conditioning and something faintly woodsy. And Ethan Blackwell was sitting in the far seat with his hands folded in his lap, and an expression on his face she had never seen on a stranger's scene before. The expression of a man who has waited for something for longer than most people wait for anything, and is now in the presence of it, and does not know yet how to be in a moment he has only ever been able to imagine. He looked at her with green eyes, the same green as the eyes she saw in the mirror every morning. He said, "You look exactly like her." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the rain moved across the windows in slow patterns. The driver pulled into traffic without being told where to go, which meant he already knew. The words came carefully in the voice of someone who had been precise about language her entire life, because precision was a form of respect. "Before you tell me anything, I need to know one thing. Are you the reason she's dead?" He flinched. It was the smallest movement, barely visible in the low light of the car, but it was real, and it told her that the question had not arrived somewhere it hadn't already been. "No," he said, "but I know who is, and I've spent 20 years trying to prove it." Outside, Manhattan moved past the windows in its indifferent blaze of light. 7 months of new life shifted against her ribs, reminding her of the stakes she was carrying. Across from her, a man with her mother's eyes and 25 years of searching folded into his stillness waited for her to decide what to do with the first honest sentence anyone had offered her in longer than she could immediately remember. She settled back against the seat. The ring Constance had placed on the tablecloth was still sitting in that restaurant, in the candlelight, on the white linen. She had not taken it with her. She had left it there deliberately, which was the first decision she had made entirely for herself in 2 years. "Then start from the beginning," she said, "and don't leave anything out." The building didn't look like a place where empires were managed. That was intentional. Blackwell Holdings occupied the top 11 floors of a tower on Fifth Avenue that announced itself through restraint rather than spectacle. Dark granite facade, minimal signage, the kind of architecture that communicates power by refusing to explain itself. Naomi had passed it a dozen times in 2 years of living in Manhattan, without registering it as anything other than one of the city's 1,000 monuments to accumulated capital. Now, riding up in an elevator that moved with the quiet efficiency of something German engineered, She understood that she had been living inside a perimeter she hadn't known existed. The 88th floor opened into a reception area that felt nothing like the institutional corridors of wealth she had anticipated. There were bookshelves, actual books, not display objects, lining two walls, a reading chair near the window with a lamp tilted toward it at the angle of regular use, and a woman in her 50s at a desk who stood when Naomi entered and said, with the warmth of someone who had been told this moment was coming and had decided to honor it properly. "Miss Voss, he's been expecting you. I'm Helen. If you need anything at all while you're here, I mean anything, you tell me." The office itself faced north and west, and at 7:30 in the morning the city below was doing what it always did regardless of what was happening in any individual life, moving, building pressure, refusing to pause for anyone's reckoning. Ethan was standing at the window when she entered. He turned, and in the daylight she could see what the car's dim interior had only suggested. The jaw that matched the photographs she had pulled on her phone the night before. The posture of a man who had spent decades making himself the most prepared person in any room he entered. And beneath all of it, visible only in the set of his eyes, something that had not been resolved by success or time or any amount of strategic patience. He was still looking for something. She understood, standing there with her coat still on and her hands pressed flat against the sides of her stomach out of the habit she'd developed of grounding herself through the baby's realness when everything else became abstract. She understood that she was what he had been looking for, and the weight of being the answer to 25 years of someone's searching landed in her chest with a force she hadn't anticipated. He gestured toward two chairs near the window. Between them, a folder sat on a low table with the deliberately casual placement of something that had actually been positioned with care. She sat. He sat. He did not begin with apology or explanation or the careful hedging of a man managing his liability. He began with a photograph. It was black and white, small, slightly overexposed in the upper left corner the way photographs taken in Alabama summer light sometimes were. A young woman standing in a yard, holding an infant against her chest with both arms, a boy of perhaps 12 or 13 standing beside her. The woman's face was turned slightly toward the boy, her expression caught in the fraction of a second between two other expressions, neither fully present nor fully elsewhere, hovering in the specific space of a woman who loved what was in front of her and was afraid of what was behind her. Naomi had one photograph of her mother from her childhood. It showed Eleanor at a church picnic, laughing at something outside the frame, wearing a yellow dress. She had kept it in the cedar box Garrett gave her after the funeral, and she had looked at it so many times that she no longer saw it fully when she looked at it. It had become an icon rather than an image, a fixed point rather than a window. This photograph was different. This was Eleanor she had never seen. Younger, unguarded in the particular way of people who don't know they're being documented. Holding an infant with the full weight of her body turned toward the child rather than the camera. The infant was Naomi. The boy was Ethan. She held the photograph for a long time without speaking. The baby shifted against her ribs, a slow roll, an elbow or a knee tracing its arc in the warm interior dark, and she pressed her palm flat against her side and breathed. Ethan did not rush her. He sat with his hands folded and waited with the practiced stillness of a man who understood that certain moments could not be moved through faster than they needed to move. When she looked up, she said, "How old was I?" 8 weeks, maybe 9. That was taken at the house on Carmichael Road in the backyard. Mom had planted tomatoes that spring. She always said she was going to learn to can them and never did. A pause. "I used to bring you lemonade when I came home from my shift at the grocery store. You couldn't drink it, obviously. I think I just wanted something to bring." The simplicity of it, the boy bringing lemonade to an infant who couldn't drink, arrived somewhere in her with a force that had nothing to do with logic. She had been braced for revelation, for the structural weight of facts rearranging themselves into new formations. She had not been braced for this. The small, ordinary tenderness of a 13-year-old trying to show up for the only sibling he had. She set the photograph on the table between them, face up. "Tell me about Owen." What followed was not a story she had ever been told, which meant there was no previous version she needed to revise. It arrived clean, which made it worse in certain ways and better in others. Owen Blackwell had been, by all external measures, a functioning man. He held jobs, maintained appearances in public settings, understood how social systems worked well enough to navigate them. Inside the house on Carmichael Road, he was something else entirely. A man who understood control as the fundamental currency of love, who responded to uncertainty with force, who had decided at some point that the people who lived with him were extensions of his will rather than independent humans with their own interior lives. Eleanor had spent years trying to make the situation workable. Then she had spent years planning to leave it. The plan required time and resources and a level of coordination that a woman in her position, isolated from her own family, financially dependent, in a city where Owen had relationships with people whose professional role was to ask questions, could not execute quickly. She found a police officer named Ray Sutton who believed her. She began documenting. She built toward a moment. Owen found out. He came home one evening when Ethan was 13, and he came home with the specific quality of controlled anger that was always more dangerous than the uncontrolled kind. The anger that knew what it was doing and did it anyway. Ethan ended up in the county hospital for 6 days. Eleanor made her choice from a hospital waiting room on a payphone, with $60 in her pocket and an infant daughter and the absolute certainty that if she waited any longer she would not survive the waiting. She had meant to come back for Ethan. She had meant it with everything she had. She had called him from a payphone in Tennessee 3 weeks after she left, and he had told her to stay gone. Had told her with the steady voice of a 13-year-old who had already decided to become someone who didn't need rescuing. "Keep Naomi safe. I'll find you when it's safe to find you." He had been, at 13, more strategically clear-headed than most adults Ethan would later meet in boardrooms. He had also been, underneath the clarity, a boy who had just told his mother to leave him behind, and who would spend the next 25 years making sure that decision had not been wasted. Owen was incarcerated for the first time 2 years after Eleanor left. Assault charges from an incident that had nothing to do with his family. Then again for robbery. The pattern continued, in and out, years of institutional interruption punctuated by years of systematic searching for a woman who had become very good at not being found. And then, 20 years ago, Eleanor Voss, driving south on Route 31 in the rain, on her way to meet Ray Sutton, who had called her with information about Owen's latest appeal and what it might mean for her safety, had gone off the road. Ray Sutton was found dead the following morning. Officially, a robbery in progress, a street crime with no witnesses and no suspects ever charged. Unofficially, a man who had known too much and been too close to making that knowledge actionable. Ethan had spent years trying to prove what he believed and Garrett had feared. The evidence was circumstantial, the trail deliberately obscured, and Owen's network of relationships with people in institutional positions had not disappeared with his incarceration. What Ethan had was a timeline, a pattern, and an investigator at the FBI named Adrienne Mack, who had been building a parallel file for 7 years and was missing the specific piece that would allow her to move. Naomi listened to all of this with the concentrated stillness of someone who has decided that the only way through a large amount of information is to take it in without filtering it through emotion in real time and process it afterward. She felt things. She would feel them properly later, in the particular privacy of 3 in the morning when the body insists on reckoning with what the mind has been managing. But she held them for now and kept listening. Then the office door opened. Adrienne Mack was 46 and wore the particular expression of someone who had delivered difficult information to people in crisis often enough to have developed a face for it. Not without empathy. but with the specific calibration of empathy that doesn't tip into performance. She set a file on the table beside the photograph and sat across from Naomi, with her hands flat on the folder for a moment before she opened it. Before I show you this, I want you to understand that the man in this photograph was not acting with full knowledge of everything his actions would mean. That doesn't change what he did. It just changes what it means about who he is. She opened the folder and turned it toward Naomi. The photograph showed Garrett Voss, Birmingham Street, midday, a concrete building in the background that Naomi recognized from the neighborhood where she'd grown up. He was talking to a man she didn't recognize. The date stamp in the corner was 26 months ago. The man Garrett was talking to had been identified, Adrian explained, as a low-level operative who moved between several of Trigg and Deacon Blackwell's organizational fronts. He had approached Garrett under the cover identity of a family services coordinator working on a genealogical reunification program. He had presented documentation. He had been, by every account, convincing, because the story he told Garrett was the story Garrett had been waiting 20 years to hear. That Ethan Blackwell had been located, that he was safe and successful, and that there was a pathway to bringing Naomi back into contact with her biological brother in a way that was controlled and secure. Garrett had wanted to fall for it. This was the brutal precision of the method. It had been designed for a man whose specific vulnerability was his love for the daughter he was trying to protect and his guilt about the family connection he had kept from her. They had given him exactly what he was most desperate to believe. He had answered questions about Naomi's address in Manhattan, her married name, her pregnancy, her history. He had provided, without understanding what he was providing, the map they needed to connect Naomi Voss to Eleanor Blackwell, to Owen Blackwell's blood. When he realized what had happened, 2 months later, when someone made a follow-up contact that asked questions slightly outside the scope of what a family reunification program would need, he had tried to stop. He had stopped returning calls. He had not known how to tell Naomi what he had done, which meant he had been carrying the specific weight of a man who loves someone and has accidentally handed a weapon to their enemy, and who does not know how to confess it without destroying the trust that is the only thing he has to offer. Naomi sat with this for a moment. The man who had walked her down an aisle 2 years ago. The man who had taught her that patience was not passivity, the man who had moved her across 2 states and built her a new name out of an old fear. The same man now, in a photograph she had never expected to see, talking to someone who was not what he appeared to be. "He's terrified," Adrian said, "and he's been trying to figure out how to tell you since he understood what he'd done." "I know," Naomi answered, because she did know, in the way you know things about people who raised you, not from evidence but from the accumulated texture of years, the distance in his voice on their last 3 phone calls, the way he had started sentences and redirected them, the quality of his silences which had changed from their usual depth into something that had an edge. "Where is he now?" He was in Nashville. He was, Adrian confirmed, in contact with the FBI's field office there, and he was frightened enough to be cooperative, and he had something with him that he had been holding for 20 years. Because Eleanor had asked him to hold it, and he had not known until recently who to give it to. Ethan slid a second folder across the table. Inside was a single sealed envelope, Eleanor's handwriting across the flap, slightly faded, the ink having done what ink does over 2 decades of sitting in a cedar box in a house in Tennessee. The words across the seal, "Open when you need it most." Naomi looked at the envelope for a long time without picking it up. "She wrote it 3 months before she died," Ethan said. "Garrett thinks she knew something was getting closer, that Ray Sutton had told her Owen's people were asking questions near Nashville." He paused. "She left it in the cedar box with specific instructions that Garrett was to give it to you when you were ready. He kept waiting for the right time. There is no right time for this kind of letter. She picked up the envelope. The paper was heavier than she expected, the kind her mother had used for anything she considered important. Cream-colored stock from a stationery shop on 20th Avenue in Birmingham that had probably closed years ago. She did not open it yet. She pressed it between both palms and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of everything her mother had known and chosen to compress into whatever was written inside. She would open it later, alone, when she could give it the full space it required. She put it carefully in her bag. "Tell me about Trig and Deacon," she said. What Adrian laid out over the following 40 minutes was the architecture of something that had been under construction for years before Naomi had any idea she was the subject of a plan. Owen Blackwell had spent his incarcerated decades building a network that operated through layers of legitimate-seeming enterprise, property management companies, a freight logistics firm in New Jersey, 2 LLCs registered in Delaware with ownership structures that took months of forensic accounting to map. The actual work of these entities was the movement of money, the storage of leverage, and the maintenance of relationships with people whose cooperation could be required rather than requested. Owen's hidden assets. The FBI's working estimate was somewhere between $30 and $50 million, accumulated through methods that had never been formally charged because the documentation had been too carefully obscured, were the inheritance that Trig and Deacon had been circling for years. Owen's final appeal had been denied 3 months ago, which meant they now operated with the certainty that he would die in federal custody and the clock on whoever else had a legitimate blood claim had started running. Naomi was that claim. Any child she bore under the specific terms of how Owen's hidden assets were structured and how biological inheritance operated under federal forfeiture law could complicate Trig and Deacon's ability to consolidate everything cleanly. The solution was not to remove Naomi. That would draw the kind of attention that collapses networks, but to control her, to ensure that her child was on record as a Harlow, legally documented as a product of a marriage that could later be used in whatever legal maneuvering they needed, and that Naomi herself was too entangled in a dissolving marriage to notice what was being built around her. Prescott had been the mechanism, not the architect. He hadn't had the imagination or the motive for it, but the mechanism leveraged through his own past paperwork into a position where his only available options all served someone else's agenda. This was the information that landed differently than all the rest. Because Naomi had spent 11 days, since finding the divorce papers, constructing a specific story about her husband in which he was the primary author of her situation. A man who had decided she was a liability and was dismantling the marriage with the cold efficiency of someone protecting their assets. She had been wrong about the scope. She had been right about the cold efficiency, but she had misattributed its source. Prescott was not Owen-level predatory. He was something almost worse in certain ways, a man who had been real with her once, who had then allowed fear of his own exposure to override everything, who had complied with the destruction of his wife's life, because the alternative cost him something he wasn't willing to pay. "He knew about the dossier on my mother," she said. Not a question. He knew the name Eleanor Blackwell appeared in the documents they gave him. We don't believe he connected it to Ethan or to the full scope of what they were after until significantly later. Adrian paused. He's not a good man in this story, but he's not the man who started it. Naomi looked out the window at the city below, which was doing what it always did. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby was still, which happened sometimes. Periods of quiet that she had learned not to interpret as worry, just as rest, just as the particular unconscious piece of something that didn't yet know what it would be born into. How long have they been watching me? The first documented contact between Trig's organization and Prescott was 18 months ago. The surveillance on your movements began approximately 14 months ago, about 2 months into your pregnancy, which meant that during the months when she had been adjusting to her body changing, when she had been reading books about what to expect and setting up the spare room with the careful optimism of someone beginning something rather than ending it. During that entire time, someone had been mapping her routine, documenting her connections, building a picture of her life that they intended to use. Anger arrived then, finally. Not the hot kind, not the kind that spends itself in immediate expression, but the slow-burning kind that settles into the floor of a person's interior and stays there and becomes fuel rather than flash. She recognized it because she had felt something adjacent to it at 17. Standing at a graveside in Birmingham while a preacher said words that had nothing to do with the woman in the ground. The specific anger of someone who has been robbed of something that cannot be replaced and is deciding what to do with that fact. "What do you need from me?" she said. Adrian and Ethan exchanged a look, brief, communicative, the look of two people who have discussed this question in advance, and reached a position they were now presenting together. "The FBI has been building this case for 7 years," Adrian answered. "What we're missing is a witness who can speak to the direct impact, someone whose life the network touched in ways that are documentable and verifiable and human. You are that witness, but we can't ask you to be that witness without first telling you what being that witness would require. Tell me." It would require her to be visible rather than hidden. It would require her to tell her own story publicly in a forum that would give the FBI the kind of media and institutional attention that made it significantly more complicated for Trigg and Deacon to take action against individuals involved. It would require her to be in Manhattan rather than a safe house which carried risk that could be managed but not eliminated. It would require, in other words, the exact opposite of what every instinct towards self-protection suggested. She thought about her mother on a payphone in Tennessee choosing to stay gone to keep her daughter safe. She thought about the 20 years between that choice and a car on Route 31 in the rain. 20 years of strategic hiding, of careful quiet, of patience deployed in the service of a safety that had not, in the end, arrived. She thought about what she would tell the baby when the baby was old enough to ask, "How did you decide?" She wanted the answer to that question to be, "I decided not to let the fear make the choice." "There's something I need to do first," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Garrett needs to hear from me before this goes any further. Not a phone call. He needs to be in a room with me." She paused. "He's been carrying what he did for 2 years, and he's been too afraid to tell me, and that means he's been alone with it. Whatever happens next, he doesn't face this alone. That's not negotiable." Something shifted in Ethan's face, the smallest adjustment in the region around his eyes, that she would later understand was the expression of a man recognizing a quality he had spent a long time hoping existed in someone he had spent a long time looking for. He reached into the folder and slid a photograph across the table. Not the one of Eleanor and the children in the yard, but a newer one. Garrett Voss this past year, at a woodworking fair in Nashville, holding up a small carved object for someone off camera. He looked older than she remembered him from her last visit 6 months ago. He looked, she realized, like a man trying to do something useful with his hands, in the absence of any other available action. "I can have him in New York by tomorrow evening," Ethan said. "FBI escort handled discreetly. He already agreed to come. He's been asking to see you since this began." "Then we do this right?" She looked at the photograph of Garrett, then at the folder, then at Adrian Mack's careful, waiting face. "And when he gets here, I want to hear everything, and not the summary, not the version that manages what I can handle. Everything." She picked up her bag, settled it across her shoulder with the careful adjustment of a woman at 7.5 months who had learned to redistribute weight with intention. She stood. "One more thing." She addressed this to both of them because it applied to both of them. "I understand why you've been careful with me. I understand the calculation. She's pregnant. She's in crisis. Give her information in pieces so she doesn't fracture. I understand it. But I need you to stop making that calculation going forward because it's the same calculation that people who underestimate quiet women always make, and I need you to know it doesn't apply to me. A pause, clean and deliberate. The only way I fracture is if I'm kept in the dark about my own life. Adrian looked at her for a moment, then opened her notebook and clicked her pen. Understood. Outside the 88th floor windows, Manhattan moved in its permanent urgent blur. Somewhere below, in the Ashford Grand, the ring Constance had placed on a white linen tablecloth was probably still sitting where it had been left, or had been moved by a server clearing the table, disposed of with the rest of the evening's debris, which was, if she thought about it, the most appropriate possible end for it. She had 3 weeks before the window Trigg and Deacon had given Prescott for delivering documentation would close. 3 weeks before their patience ran out, and their methods became less procedural. She had a half-brother who had spent 25 years becoming the most prepared person in any room for exactly this moment. She had an FBI investigator who had been waiting 7 years for a witness willing to stand in the light. And she had her mother's letter in her bag, unopened, pressing against her side with the weight of everything Eleanor Voss had known and decided to write down in a year. When she had understood that time might be shorter than she hoped, that night in the apartment that Ethan had arranged, not the place she had shared with Prescott, which felt like a stage set for a performance she had exited, but a spare apartment 2 blocks from Blackwell Holdings that Helen had organized with the quiet efficiency of someone who had anticipated this need. Naomi sat on the floor with her back against the couch and her legs stretched out and the envelope in her hands. She opened it slowly, not from ceremony but from the instinct to preserve whatever Eleanor's hands had touched. The letter was 3 pages, cream paper, her mother's careful teacher's handwriting filling the lines with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had decided every word mattered. She read it through once, then again. Then she sat for a long time with the pages in her lap and her hand on her stomach and the city outside the window doing what it always did, moving and building pressure and refusing to pause. Eleanor had known, not everything, not the specific names or the mechanisms, but the shape of it, the general topology of what might come. She had known that Owen's world did not end with his imprisonment, that the things he had built continued to operate on the logic he had instilled in them. She had known that Naomi might one day find herself inside the radius of something she hadn't chosen. The last paragraph was the one that Naomi read 3 times. Her mother had written, "I spent years trying to protect you by making myself smaller, by hiding you, by asking you to be invisible. I understand now that this was not protection. It was just a different kind of cage. The things worth having in this life require you to be seen. Don't let anyone, not fear, not love, not the weight of what I've carried, convince you that your safety lies in your silence. It never did. It doesn't now." Naomi folded the letter with the same care with which it had been written, returned it to the envelope, and sat in the quiet of the apartment for a long time. The baby turned, a slow, full rotation, purposeful and calm. "I hear her," Naomi said to no one in the room and to the one person who was always listening. Tomorrow Garrett would arrive. The day after, Adrienne would lay out the full operational picture, and somewhere across the city in a building she had never been to and hoped never to enter, Trigg and Deacon Blackwell were waiting for a compliance that was not coming. She was done making herself invisible. Her mother had paid the price for a safety that invisibility couldn't actually provide, and Naomi had watched it arrive at a graveside in Birmingham when she was 17 and had been waiting ever since, without knowing she was waiting, for the moment when she would finally have enough of the truth to decide what to do with it. She had it now, all of it. All, or enough of it that the shape was clear. Tomorrow she would begin. Garrett Voss arrived at JFK on a Tuesday evening flight from Nashville, escorted by 2 agents from the FBI's Tennessee field office, who had the practiced neutrality of people paid to be present, without being intrusive. Naomi was waiting in a private arrival area that Ethan had arranged. A room off the main terminal corridor, functional and quiet, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly more exhausted than they actually were. She heard him before she saw him. His walk had always had a particular sound, the slight drag of his left foot from an old workshop injury, the specific rhythm of a large man moving carefully through spaces he wasn't sure belonged to him. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her. He was 67 years old, and he looked it in a way he hadn't looked 6 months ago. The last time she had sat across from him at his kitchen table in Nashville over coffee that went cold, while they talked about nothing consequential. The new lines were not just age. They were the topography of 2 years of carrying something he couldn't put down and couldn't share, and she recognized the particular exhaustion of that specific weight, because she had been carrying her own version of it for longer than she had admitted to herself. She crossed the room and put her arms around him, which required a slightly awkward adjustment for the pregnancy. And he held on with the grip of a man who had been afraid he might not get to do this again. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The fluorescent light hummed. One of the agents found something important to examine on the far wall. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were wet and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was determined not to let grief become performance. He looked at her stomach, at the full visible weight of 7.5 months, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite sorrow, but contained elements of both. "She would have been so proud of you," he said. His voice came out rougher than intended, the words having traveled through more internal resistance than he'd anticipated. "Your mother, she would have—" He stopped, started again. "I should have told you years ago. I should have told you everything." "You were afraid," Naomi answered, "and you made a choice from that fear that you thought was protecting me. That's not the same as betrayal, Garrett. I need you to understand the difference, because I can't move forward if you're spending the next 5 years dismantling yourself over it." He looked at her for a long time, reading her face with the attention of a man who had watched her face since she was 17 and knew every register of it. He found what he was looking for, not absolution, because she wasn't offering absolution for something that hadn't been a crime against her, but something more useful: accuracy. She was telling him the truth of how she experienced it, and the truth was that she understood, and understanding was not the same as forgiveness being required. He nodded once slowly and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The envelope he produced was smaller than she expected. A standard letter envelope, the kind sold in drugstores, addressed in Ray Sutton's handwriting to a P.O. box in Nashville, that Garrett had maintained for years without telling anyone why. "He mailed it the day before he died," Garrett said. "I think he knew something was wrong. I think he sent it to me because Eleanor had given him my contact as her emergency backup, and he had no one else to give it to." A pause. "I've kept it sealed because I was afraid of what opening it would mean. Afraid of what knowing would require me to do." She took the envelope. She would give it to Adrian in the morning. Whatever Ray Sutton had committed to paper in the last hours before a street robbery that wasn't a robbery was now, 20 years later, the piece that Adrian had told her the case was still missing. That night, the three of them, Naomi, Ethan, and Garrett, sat in the Blackwell Holdings apartment kitchen and ate takeout from a Thai place on 57th Street, and talked for 4 hours about Eleanor. Not about Owen or Trigg or Deacon or federal case strategy. About Eleanor. Her laugh. Her specific preferences about music and tea and the correct way to fold a fitted sheet. The way she could look at a child who was struggling and say exactly the right 3 words without seeming to have calculated them. Garrett told stories Naomi had never heard. Ethan told stories that made Garrett laugh in the surprised way of someone encountering a piece of a person they had loved from a completely different angle. It was the most honest room Naomi had been in for 2 years, possibly longer. She fell asleep on the couch at 11:30 with her hand on her stomach and Garrett's voice still moving through the apartment, telling Ethan about the summer Eleanor had decided to learn woodworking and had produced a side table that was, by objective measure, the most structurally unsound piece of furniture either of them had ever seen, and how she had displayed it in the living room for 6 months with complete sincerity. Ray Sutton's letter contained 11 pages of handwritten notes, organized with the methodical clarity of a man who understood that disorder is how evidence disappears. He had documented, over the preceding 18 months of his investigation, the specific financial pathways through which Owen Blackwell had moved money out of legitimate reach, a layered system of LLCs and shell companies that connected back, at the third remove, to two individuals Owen had described in his own recorded statements as his insurance. The names were Trigg and Deacon Blackwell. The date on the documentation predated by nearly 2 decades any of the financial records Adrienne's team had assembled independently. Adrienne received the envelope at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning. She read it at her desk with the contained expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of information for long enough that its arrival produces not excitement, but something quieter and more durable. The particular satisfaction of a structure finally becoming load-bearing. By 10 o'clock she had been on 3 calls. By noon she had 2 additional warrants moving through the federal system. She called Ethan at 12:40 and said, with the economy of someone who had learned not to over-communicate in sensitive circumstances, "We're ready when she is." The press conference was set for Thursday morning. Naomi spent Wednesday afternoon in the conference room on the 88th floor with Ethan, Adrienne, and a woman named Priscilla Dunn, who was Blackwell Holdings' chief communications officer, and who had the specific quality of someone who had spent 20 years managing high-stakes narratives and could identify in 30 seconds where a story's structural weakness was. They worked through what Naomi would say, not scripting it. Priscilla had been clear that scripted testimony reads as managed, and managed reads as afraid. But mapping the territory, identifying the points where precision mattered most, building the internal architecture of something that could support its own weight under pressure. Naomi had one condition, which she stated at the beginning of the session and which was not negotiable. She would tell her own story in her own words. She would not shape it to make it more comfortable for the people in the room. She would not soften the parts that were difficult or spare any individual, herself included, from the accuracy of what had actually happened. "The only version of this that works," she said, "is the true one. The moment I start editing for comfort, it stops being testimony and becomes performance." Priscilla looked at her for a moment and then wrote something in her notebook. "Okay," she said, "then let's make sure the true version lands with everything it actually contains." They worked until 7 in the evening. Naomi went back to the apartment, ate dinner, reread her mother's letter one more time, and slept for 6 hours with the specific depth of someone whose body has finally been allowed to stop bracing. Thursday morning arrived with the particular clarity of late autumn in New York. Cold, bright, the air having shed the ambiguity of transitional weather in favor of something more definite. The conference room on the 88th floor had been configured for media access, which meant the familiar furniture had been replaced by rows of chairs facing a podium, and the room that had felt intimate 2 days ago now had the heightened atmosphere of a space that understood its own significance. CNN had sent 2 crews. NBC and ABC each had one. The New York Times had their courts and criminal justice reporter, which signaled how the story had been characterized in advance briefings, not as a human interest piece, but as a federal criminal matter with a personal dimension. The Wall Street Journal was present because Blackwell Holdings was publicly traded, and the financial implications of what was about to be disclosed had implications their readership needed to understand. 14 additional outlets filled the remaining seats. Adrienne's people were positioned throughout the building and at both street-level entrances, not visibly armed but present in the specific way of people who have been briefed on contingencies. The warrants for Trigg and Deacon had been executed at 6:15 that morning, at an apartment complex in Jersey City where they had been under surveillance for 11 days. The arrests had been clean and without incident. Trigg had opened the door in a bathrobe and Deacon had been eating breakfast, and neither of them had offered resistance because neither of them had expected this particular morning to be the one. Naomi learned this from Adrienne at 8:50, 10 minutes before the conference was scheduled to begin. She received the information without visible reaction, which was not the absence of feeling but the presence of a kind of deep structural calm that had been building since she had opened her mother's letter. She had understood, reading Eleanor's words, that she had been waiting her entire adult life to be in exactly this position. Not the specific circumstances which no one could have predicted, but the fundamental choice between the safety of invisibility and the cost of being seen. She had made her decision. She had made it the night she read the letter, sitting on the floor of an apartment that wasn't hers with the city moving outside the window. She was simply now walking toward the thing she had already decided. At 9 o'clock, Helen knocked on the door of the small anteroom where Naomi had been waiting with Ethan and Garrett. "They're ready." Garrett stood. He looked at her the way he had looked at her at 17, standing outside the church in Birmingham with his hat in his hands, with the expression of a man who loves someone in a way that does not require anything from them in return. "Your mother knew what she was doing when she left you in this world," he said. "She knew exactly what she was leaving." She squeezed his hand once, then she walked out. The room rearranged itself when she entered, the particular reorientation of cameras and attention, and the ambient expectation of 50-something people who have been told, "Something important is coming." She stood at the podium and looked out at the room with the composed directness of a woman who had decided that the story she was about to tell belonged to her and no one else, and whose ownership of it was not diminished by the fact that she was sharing it. "My name is Naomi Voss," she began, and her voice came out the way she had intended it, clear, unhurried, carrying the weight of what it was saying without being flattened by it. "I am a former third-grade teacher from Nashville, Tennessee. I am 7.5 months pregnant with my first child, and I am here today to tell you about a series of events that I spent the past several months trying to understand, and that I now understand completely." She paused. She looked at the room, at the reporters with their notebooks and cameras, at Adrienne standing near the far wall with her hands at her sides, at Ethan positioned to her left where she could see him if she chose to look. This is not a story about a bad marriage. It is a story about what happens when people with criminal intent understand that a woman's trust is an available resource and decide to extract value from it. It is a story about family secrets that were carried alone when they should have been shared, and about the specific damage that silence does to the people it is supposed to protect. She placed both hands flat on the podium, the same gesture she had made at the dinner table in the Ashford Grand, the gesture of grounding herself in something solid. "And it is a story about a woman named Eleanor Voss, who was my mother, who died 20 years ago on a road in Alabama under circumstances that were not what they were recorded as being, and who left me a letter that I read 3 days ago and that I intend to spend the rest of my life answering." The room was completely still. She spoke for 31 minutes. She told them about the marriage and about Prescott and about the divorce papers she had found and the name Eleanor Blackwell printed on a genealogical database page. She told them about Constance Harlow and the ring on the tablecloth and the rain outside the Ashford Grand. She told them about Ethan and about Owen Blackwell's incarceration and about the network that had been operating for years, beneath the surface of legitimate enterprise. She told them about Trigg and Deacon and what they had intended and what they had done to Garrett to accomplish it. She told them about Ray Sutton who had believed her mother and had died for it, and whose letter had been sitting in a Nashville post office box for 20 years, waiting for someone to be ready to use it. She told the truth with the precision of someone who understands that accuracy is not the enemy of emotion, that the most powerful thing a person can offer an audience is a version of events that is so factually complete that it leaves no room for an alternative narrative to take root. When she finished, the questions came quickly and from multiple directions. The competitive pressure of 50 journalists who understood they were in the presence of a story that had layers they had not anticipated. She answered each one directly, referred those that touched ongoing federal proceedings to Adrienne, and did not allow herself to be moved from the position of someone who was presenting information rather than performing distress. Then Adrienne stepped to the podium. "I want to provide the law enforcement context for what you've just heard." Her voice had the practiced clarity of someone who had testified in federal court enough times to understand that precision and accessibility were not mutually exclusive. At approximately 6:15 this morning, federal agents arrested Trig Blackwell and Deacon Blackwell at their residence in Jersey City, New Jersey, on charges including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in connection with the deaths of Eleanor Voss and Ray Sutton, a former law enforcement officer in Alabama 20 years ago. She paused to allow the room to absorb this. These charges are the result of a 7-year investigation. The final evidentiary piece that allowed us to move to prosecution was provided by a letter written by Ray Sutton in the days before his death, which was preserved and delivered by a private individual who came forward this week. She looked briefly at Garrett, who was standing near the back of the room, and then returned her gaze to the assembled press. "Owen Blackwell, currently serving a life sentence at USP Hazleton, West Virginia, has been named as a co-conspirator in those deaths and will face additional charges." The room erupted into overlapping questions. Adrienne handled them with the methodical efficiency of someone who had anticipated each one. Naomi stood slightly to the side of the podium and watched the room move with the particular quality of attention she had been developing since the night in the car with Ethan. The quality of someone who has stopped trying to control what is happening and has instead decided to be fully present for it. She felt the baby move, a slow, deliberate shift that she had come to recognize as the baby's response to elevated ambient energy, and she placed one hand against her side and pressed gently, a small private communication between them that said, "I know, I've got you. Pay attention. This is what it looks like when the truth is bigger than the fear, sir." The consequences arrived not as a single event, but as a sequence, each one following the previous with the logic of a structure that had been engineered to collapse in a particular order when the load-bearing element was removed. Prescott Harlow had walked into the FBI's Manhattan field office at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, 3 hours before the press conference began, accompanied by his attorney and carrying a drive containing 14 months of documentation. Communication records, financial transfers, the original torsion documents Trigg and Deacon had used to leverage him, and a written statement that laid out, in the precise language of a man who had spent 20 years learning to construct legal narratives, everything he had done and why and for whom. His cooperation had been calculated, as most of his decisions were calculated. The calculation this time, however, had been stripped of the self-deception that had characterized the previous 18 months. He was not telling the truth because it would save him, but because it was the only remaining option that did not make everything worse. He received 14 months in a federal minimum security facility, the loss of his bar license, and a financial settlement that left him with approximately 11% of what he had possessed before. He did not contest any of it. He sat through the sentencing with the expression of a man experiencing consequences he had manufactured himself, which is a specific kind of reckoning that has no comfortable position. Constance Harlow was not charged with any crime, because what Constance had done existed in the space between legal and moral that the law has never successfully mapped. She had been cruel within the available architecture of deniability. She had engineered humiliation with the precision of someone who understood that the most damage is done with instruments that leave no visible marks. The system that had protected her from consequence for 66 years continued to protect her from legal consequence now. What it could not protect her from was the particular justice of social reality. The Atlantic Women's Council, the philanthropic organization Constance had chaired for 11 years, and through which she had maintained the network of relationships that constituted her actual power, sent a letter within 72 hours of the press conference informing her that her chairmanship was being transitioned to an interim officer pending a governance review. The review concluded in 3 weeks with a recommendation that she step down permanently, which she did, because the alternative was a public vote that she would lose. The club on the Upper East Side, where she had lunched twice weekly for 2 decades, did not renew her annual membership. When she attended a charity gala 6 weeks after the press conference, because she was Constance Harlow and she had decided that visibility was the only remaining strategy, the room did not turn hostile. It did something more effective. It continued its own conversations. It did not reorganize itself around her presence. It treated her, for the first time in her adult life, as someone it was not necessary to acknowledge. She moved 4 months later into a 2-bedroom condominium in White Plains, which she had purchased under the rationalization that she was simplifying rather than retreating. She lived there with the furniture she had kept from the Harlow family apartment, and the particular silence of a woman who had built her entire interior life out of the management of other people's estimation of her, and who found herself now in a room where that management had nowhere to go. She was not destroyed. Naomi had not wanted her destroyed. Destruction requires investment. An investment in Constance Harlow's suffering was not something Naomi was willing to spend herself on. What she had wanted, what she had gotten, was accuracy. The world had adjusted its understanding of who Constance Harlow actually was, and that adjustment was now permanent and structural, woven into the record in a way that Constance's careful management could not unwrite. Sloane Whitfield had left the apartment she had briefly shared with Prescott 29 days after the press conference. She had the instincts of someone who had learned early that proximity to failing structures was the primary professional risk in her world, and she applied those instincts with the same decisiveness she brought to everything else. She did not explain herself to anyone. She didn't need to. The explanation was legible in the math of the situation, and everyone who needed to understand it did. Trigg and Deacon Blackwell entered federal custody in New Jersey and were transferred to separate facilities within 2 weeks, a standard procedure in conspiracy cases designed to reduce the coordination that defendants under the same roof tend to find useful. Their attorney filed preliminary motions that Adrienne's team had anticipated and prepared for. The trial was projected to begin in 14 months. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case had tried 12 organized crime cases and won 11 of them, and he had the particular appetite for the 12th that people in competitive professions develop when they're carrying an unresolved number. Owen Blackwell, at USP Hazleton, received the notification of additional charges with a stillness that the corrections officer present later described as unsurprising for a man who had spent decades anticipating scenarios and preparing responses. He requested to speak with his attorney and then said nothing further. He was 71 years old and in declining health, and the additional charges, even without a conviction, which would take years to obtain, ensured that the remainder of his life would be spent in an institutional context he had never managed to build relationships sufficient to escape. His hidden assets, once located through the financial map Ray Sutton had drawn 20 years earlier, were seized under federal forfeiture law. There was, in the end, nothing to inherit. Trigg and Deacon had waited 25 years for a fortune that the patience of one dead police officer and one living woman had already dismantled. Wren Eleanor Voss was born on a Sunday morning in early December at NYU Langone Medical Center. In a delivery room where Ethan stood against the far wall and cried with the undisguised openness of someone who had spent so long managing his emotions for strategic purposes that their release, when it finally came, was total and unashamed. Garrett was in the hallway, sitting in a plastic chair with his hands clasped between his knees, and when a nurse told him the baby had arrived and both mother and child were well, he bent forward and pressed his forehead to his hands and stayed there for a while. She was 6 pounds, 14 ounces, and she arrived with the specific alertness of a baby who seems to have been paying attention to everything that happened before she got here. Naomi held her in the first minutes with the concentrated presence of someone encountering something she had prepared for as thoroughly as preparation allows, and for which preparation turns out to be entirely insufficient. The baby looked at her, the unfocused gaze of a newborn directed at the general area of her face, and Naomi felt something reorganize itself in the foundational layer of who she was. Not new, not dramatic, just permanent. Like a door that closes and becomes a wall. The name had been decided 3 weeks before. Wren, for the bird that sings louder than its size, suggests is possible. Eleanor, because some debts are paid not with money but with memory, with the decision to carry a name forward into a future the person who owned it never reached. Ethan came to the bedside when the nurses had finished their work and Garrett had been allowed in from the hallway. He stood looking at the baby with an expression that had nothing calculated in it, just the raw, uncomplicated response of a man meeting someone he was already prepared to love. "She has the eyes," he said. He meant the green. He meant Eleanor. He meant everything that had been carried forward through all of it to arrive here in this room in this particular light. "She has the eyes," Naomi agreed. "She's going to know what to do with them." The Wren Foundation held its first public event 11 months after the press conference, in the private dining room of the Ashford Grand, a choice that Priscilla Dunn had initially characterized as unnecessarily theatrical, before reconsidering and acknowledging that it was, in fact, exactly right. The room had been reconfigured from its annual dinner arrangement into something that worked better for the event's purpose. Round tables rather than a single long one, the lighting adjusted from intimate to clear, the entrance open rather than controlled. 43 women attended. They came from different circumstances and different cities and different versions of the specific experience that the foundation addressed. The experience of having been made smaller, systematically and by design, by someone who understood exactly which mechanisms to use and used them with precision. Some of them had legal resources, some of them had none. Some of them had only recently understood what had been done to them, and some of them had understood for years and had been waiting for a structure that would make their understanding actionable. The foundation's work, legal support, financial advocacy, connections to housing resources and employment networks, had been operating for 3 months before the event, funded initially by the assets released from Naomi's settlement with the Harlow estate and supplemented by Blackwell Holdings' philanthropic arm. Ethan had offered more than she took. She had taken what she needed to build something real and left the rest in his hands, which was the kind of partnership she had decided she was willing to have, one that operated on honesty rather than obligation. Naomi spoke near the end of the evening, with Wren asleep in a carrier against her chest, 7 months old by then, heavier and more opinionated than the first weeks. Already communicating preferences about sound and light with the clarity of someone who had decided that communication was going to be her primary instrument. Naomi did not use notes. She said the things she had been working out for 11 months in the spaces between the practical decisions and the legal proceedings and the middle-of-the-night nursing sessions that had turned out to be, unexpectedly, some of the clearest thinking time she'd had in years. "I used to believe that the opposite of being controlled was being free," she said to the room. I've learned that it's more specific than that. The opposite of being controlled is being accurate. Being unwilling to accept someone else's story about who you are when you have evidence to the contrary. Most of what was done to me required my participation. It required me to doubt my own reading of situations, to give more weight to someone else's version of reality than to what I could see directly in front of me. She looked at the faces in the room, some of them nodding, some of them very still in the particular way of people hearing something described that they have been trying to find words for. The moment I stopped doing that, the whole structure fell apart. Not because I had become powerful, but because it had never been built from anything real to begin with. Callum Reed was there near the back of the room in a jacket rather than a server's uniform. He had started his first year at Fordham Law in September, and he had the look of someone who was discovering, somewhat to his surprise, that the thing he had suspected he might be good at, he was actually good at. He had not asked for anything when he came to the event, had simply registered like the other attendees and found a seat and listened. She had seen him when she walked in and had nodded, which was enough. Some acknowledgments don't require architecture. After the formal program, Adrienne Mack found her near the room's large windows where Naomi had gone to give Ren a view of the street below, which the baby seemed to find more interesting than the adult proceedings. Adrienne had the particular quality of someone in the late stages of a long case, not exhausted but settled, like a structure that has finished being built and is now simply standing. I need to tell you something before the trial calendar gets busy and I'm harder to reach, Adrienne said. We closed Ray Sutton's case last week, officially. The filing went through and the record has been amended to reflect the true cause of death. A pause. His daughter is 43. She's been asking questions about her father's death since she was old enough to understand. The official explanation didn't hold together. She's going to get an accurate answer now. Adrienne looked at her steadily. That's because you came forward. I want you to know that specifically, not in the abstract, specifically. Naomi held that for a moment. 20 years of a daughter knowing her father's death had been recorded wrong. 20 years of a family carrying a shape of grief that didn't quite match the true shape of the loss because the true shape had been obscured by the interests of people who had decided the truth was inconvenient. Does she know yet? She asked. She will by Thursday. I'm making that call myself. Ren made a sound against her chest. Not distress, just presence. Just the ongoing announcement of existence that babies make in their first year with the regularity of a tide. Naomi shifted her weight, adjusted the carrier, looked out at the street below where the city continued its permanent motion. My mother wrote something in that letter, she said. She wrote that she had spent years trying to protect me by asking me to be invisible, and that she understood at the end that it had never been protection, that it had just been a different kind of cage. She paused. I think about that when I'm afraid, which is still often. The fear didn't go away because the circumstances changed, but the cage did. Adrienne was quiet for a moment, then, Your mother was right, and she raised someone who understood it. She picked up her coat from a nearby chair. The trial starts in 8 months. You'll be subpoenaed as a material witness, which is procedural. Your testimony will be depositioned. It won't be easy, but it will be the last time you'll need to walk through it formally. I know, Naomi said. I'll be there. Adrienne left. The room began to empty in the gradual way of events that have ended well. The conversations that continue past the program, the exchanges of contact information. The specific energy of people who came in carrying something and are leaving carrying something different. Ethan found her eventually, as he had developed the habit of doing in the months since the press conference, not intrusively, not with the weight of accumulated missed time, but with the quiet consistency of someone learning a new practice. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the street below, and neither of them spoke for a minute. which was the particular comfort of being with someone who doesn't require you to fill silence with performance. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about next year," she answered. "The foundation. 3 cities. We talked about 3 cities for the second cohort. I think we need 4. There are women in Atlanta who've been waiting for something like this for longer than we've been building it." He nodded. 4. She looked down at Ren, who had fallen asleep against her chest with the absolute commitment to unconsciousness that only the very young can manage in noisy rooms. The baby's weight was solid and warm and specific. Not abstract, not symbolic, just real, the realest thing in the room, breathing its slow breath against her sternum. "She's going to have questions someday," Naomi said, "about all of it, about Owen and Trigg and Prescott and what this year was, about her grandmother." She ran her thumb gently along the curve of the baby's cheek. "I've been thinking about what to tell her." "What did you decide?" "That the truth is the most protective thing you can give someone. Not the comfortable version. The actual version, given when they're ready for it, given without making them responsible for how it lands." She looked up at Ethan, and that her grandmother was a woman who ran from a terrible man because she loved her children, and who spent 20 years hoping the distance would be enough, and who understood at the end that it wasn't distance that protected the people you love. She paused. "It's the willingness to be seen." Outside, the city moved in its indifferent, magnificent blur. The Ashford Grand, which had been the site of a demolition 11 months ago, was now the site of something built. Not the same thing, not a reconstruction of what had been before, but something with different materials and different load-bearing points and a purpose that the previous structure had never been designed to serve. Somewhere across the city, in a 2-bedroom condominium in White Plains, a woman sat in a room full of furniture she had chosen for a different life. Somewhere in a federal facility in West Virginia, a man was spending a night that was indistinguishable from the night before it. And somewhere in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, a man was sitting with the specific quality of a person who has nothing left to manage, who has stripped away every layer of strategy and calculation and arrived at the raw fact of what he had chosen in the year that mattered most, to do with the trust of someone who had offered it genuinely. Naomi thought about him sometimes, not with warmth, and not with the corrosive, sustained anger that would have required her to keep him at the center of her attention, with the specific accuracy she had been practicing. He had been real with her once, then he had been afraid, then he had made the choices that fear recommended. People who underestimate the cost of their own fear make those calculations every day. They just don't always do it in circumstances that make the accounting so visible. She had told his attorney, through her own, that she would not contest reasonable visitation rights when the child was old enough to choose. This was not generosity. It was a decision made on behalf of Ren Eleanor Voss, who deserved to grow up making her own determinations about the people in her story rather than inheriting her mother's. The distinction mattered. It was the kind of distinction Eleanor had not been in a position to make for her own children, and Naomi understood that the inheritance she actually wanted to pass forward was not money or circumstance, but exactly this: the willingness to let the next generation be free of the previous one's unfinished business. The room had nearly emptied. Garrett was collecting his coat near the entrance, talking to one of the foundation's board members, laughing at something in the way he laughed when he was actually surprised rather than performing sociability, full and unguarded, the laugh that had been the sound of safety when she was 17 and the world had changed its shape. She watched him from across the room and felt the particular form of love that doesn't require anything. Not reciprocation, not continuity, not the maintenance of any story. Just the fact of someone having been present when presence was the only available form of help, and having given it without reservation. She was going to be okay, not in the provisional sense of someone managing a situation, but in the structural sense, the sense of a foundation that has been tested and has held and now knows its own load-bearing capacity. She had walked through the worst year of her adult life, and she had come out the other side with her daughter on her chest and her brother beside her, and the knowledge that the thing she had been most afraid of, being seen, being fully visible in all the complexity of what her life actually contained, had been the only thing that had ever actually protected her. She pressed her lips to the top of Wren's head. The baby smelled like warmth and something faintly sweet, and the specific, irreplaceable smell of new life that parents spend the rest of their lives trying to remember exactly. "We're going to be okay," she said softly. Not to the room, not to the city, not to the year behind her or the one ahead, to her daughter, to Eleanor, whose letter was in her bag and would be, for the rest of her life, to the woman she had been at the beginning of all this, who had sat at the far end of a table in a room full of people performing their own versions of themselves and had not yet understood that the quiet she carried was not a deficit, but an instrument, not a cage, but a foundation, not the absence of power, but the most expensive form it takes. Outside, the November night had settled into the cold clarity that follows a long rain. The city blazed. She picked up her coat. She walked toward the door. She did not look back.